Sometimes progress in a system doesn't look like progress at all. At the end of the previous episode, the case had finally started to move again. A new social worker had been assigned after months of uncertainty, and on paper that seemed like a turning point. It felt as though the situation might finally begin to stabilize. Before continuing, I should briefly explain something about how this series is being presented. The voice you are hearing is a synthetic reconstruction of my voice, and the video image is also a digital recreation. Both were created using voice and image modeling technology. I use them because the condition I live with, Friedreich's ataxia, makes sustained speaking and filming difficult. The events described here are real, and they come from documents, emails, and records created while these events were unfolding. When the new social worker was allocated, it genuinely felt as though something had shifted. After such a long period of confusion, any movement at all seemed promising. But the underlying problems hadn't actually disappeared. The missing assessment still hadn't been properly clarified, and the overall structure of the case still felt unstable. By that point, I had already started looking for another kind of support. I began trying to find an advocate. In my mind, an advocate was someone who would take hold of the situation and help guide it toward a solution. Someone who would understand both the legal framework and the practical reality of disability. I thought that if someone like that became involved, the council might begin to take the situation more seriously. So I started making calls, I contacted organizations, I placed my name on waiting lists. I spent time researching different advocacy services that worked with disabled people navigating social care. Eventually, I was allocated an advocate through an organization called Power. At the time, that felt like a major step forward. But introducing an advocate created a different kind of challenge. In order for the advocate to understand the situation, I first had to explain everything that had happened up to that point. The history of the case, the missing assessment, the long gaps in communication, the financial questions, the emails that had already been exchanged. So a large amount of time went into reconstructing the story of the case itself. We began having regular meetings, often 2 or 3 times a week, going through what had happened and what was currently unfolding. At the same time, new emails continued arriving from different parts of the council, which meant I had to keep the advocate updated constantly. Every new message had to be explained. Every development had to be passed on. Every misunderstanding had to be clarified again. So, even though an advocate had been introduced to help represent me, I still found myself doing most of the work required to keep the situation organized. And all of this was happening while I was still living without the level of care I had originally been trying to secure. Day-to-day life hadn't become easier. I was still struggling with basic things. Preparing food, managing laundry, changing bed sheets, and falling. Sometimes I would fall and struggle to get back up for hours. I would be on the floor, sweating, exhausted, trying repeatedly to pull myself upright. There was no one there to help, so the only option was to keep trying, until eventually I managed it. Over time I had also simplified my diet almost completely. I was now fully relying on powdered nutritional drinks, because preparing proper meals simply took too much time and energy. They were quick to mix, quick to consume, and they allowed me to save what little energy I had for dealing with everything else. The time and effort required to manage the case had to come from somewhere, and often that meant reducing other parts of life just to keep up with the administrative load. It became increasingly clear to me that many disabled people in this situation would simply give up, not because they didn't need the support, but because pursuing the support required so much sustained effort. If the choice becomes surviving day to day or continuing to fight through administrative complexity, it's easy to see why many people would choose survival. But I have begun to realize something else. If the underlying problem could actually be solved, if the system could work the way it was supposed to, then all of that effort would eventually become unnecessary. Life could become stable, stress could reduce, and the time spent managing a broken process could instead be spent building something positive. Those were the thoughts that kept me pushing forward. At that point, I still believed the official process would eventually correct itself. But what happened next began to change that understanding. Because although the case appeared to be moving again, the communication around it started to become more and more complicated. There were now multiple conversations happening at once. Emails about the financial assessment, separate discussions about disability-related expenditure, messages about the care assessment itself, conversations involving the advocate, and occasionally emails between council staff that ended up copied into my inbox as well. None of these threads were particularly well connected to each other. Replies appeared outside the original chains. Messages referred to information that wasn't included in the email itself. Sometimes they referenced details that no longer applied to the situation. And the emails themselves were often rushed. There were spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, statements that didn't line up with earlier information, details that seemed to refer to circumstances that had already been resolved or had never really existed in the first place. So in order to keep track of what was happening, I began building my own record. I gathered the emails, arranged them chronologically, and created an evidence file simply so I could follow the sequence of events. Without doing that, it would have been almost impossible to understand what was going on. What made this especially difficult was the rhythm of the communication. There were periods when emails would arrive frequently, sometimes several in the same day. During those stretches, I was constantly responding, reading messages, drafting replies, forwarding information, correcting misunderstandings, and every new email triggered a physical stress response. My heart would start beating faster. My hands would shake. I would feel agitated almost immediately. But there were also long stretches of silence, times when nobody replied at all. Emails I had sent simply sat unanswered. And strangely, those periods were not relaxing either. The silence didn't mean the situation had been resolved. It meant I was waiting to see whether someone would respond, waiting to see whether the issue had been understood, or whether it had simply been ignored. So the pressure never really switched off. Even during the quiet periods, I remained tense, anticipating what might happen next. Every email I wrote had a clear purpose. I had tried to explain things as directly as possible, to ask precise questions, to make the situation difficult to misunderstand. But even when the message was clear, the replies sometimes seemed to reinterpret what I had written. And when the point I was making was particularly direct, those were often the moments when no reply came at all. By this stage, something had started to shift in how I understood the situation. Earlier in the story, when my friend suggested that the problem might be structural, I hadn't fully accepted that idea. It was easier to assume that individual mistakes were causing the confusion. But the longer the situation continued, the harder that explanation became to maintain. Different people were involved, different departments were involved, yet the same kinds of problems kept appearing. The same communication loops, the same administrative confusion. Gradually, I began to realize that what I was experiencing probably wasn't about individual behavior alone. It seemed to be something about the structure of the system itself. Oddly, that realization had a mixed effect. On one hand, it reduced some of the anger and confusion I had been feeling. If the problem was structural, then it wasn't simply a matter of individual people behaving badly. But on the other hand, it also meant something else. If the problem was structural, then resolving it would likely require far more persistence and effort than I had originally imagined. Eventually, I reached a point where email communication simply wasn't working. Messages were being sent, sometimes replies arrived, sometimes they didn't, and even when replies did come back, they often created new misunderstandings rather than resolving the old ones. At the time, I didn't know much about formal complaint procedures. I didn't understand the staged escalation processes that existed. To me, the council itself felt like the highest level involved. So instead of writing another email, I tried something different. I decided to record a video. In that video, I explained the situation as clearly as I could. The timeline, the problems, and what I was asking for. Then I sent it to the council, and that decision would lead to the next stage of the story.